The most dangerous man in Seoul sat helpless in seat 1A, watching his baby starve, until a poor black woman in the aisle seat did the unthinkable. The infant's screams tore through the first-class cabin at 30,000 feet like a blade through silk. Relentless, desperate, raw, every passenger within earshot flinched, shifted uncomfortably in their leather seats, or cast irritated glances toward the source of the chaos. But no one spoke. No one complained. Not when they saw the man cradling the child. Cheon Dae-sung sat frozen in seat 1A, his entire body coiled with tension that could snap bone. The custom-tailored charcoal suit that usually made him look like death personified now felt like a straitjacket. Traditional Korean tattoos, dragons coiling around phoenixes, crawled up his neck from beneath his crisp white collar, disappearing into the shadows of his jawline, marks of absolute power that meant nothing in this moment. His normally arctic, calculating eyes held something foreign, something he'd never allowed anyone to witness. Terror. The baby his son continued to wail, tiny fists batting weakly against Dae-sung's chest. 4 months old and already carrying a burden he couldn't possibly understand. 4 months since Jiyeon had taken her final breath, bringing this child into the world. 4 months since Cheon Dae-sung, the man they called the Dragon of Seoul, the phantom who controlled the Korean underworld from the shadows, had become something he never imagined possible. Powerless. "Sir," one of his men leaned in from the row behind, voice barely audible over the crying. "We could request an emergency landing. Get a doctor." "No." Dae-sung's voice cut like a winter wind. "We maintain course." But his son didn't care about schedules or territories or the empire built on fear. The infant only knew hunger gnawing at his belly, only knew the absence of the warmth that had surrounded him for 4 precious months before it vanished forever. Dae-sung had tried everything. Formula bottles prepared by the rotating staff of nannies who couldn't last more than a week. Pacifiers the child rejected with surprising strength. Rocking motions that felt clumsy and wrong in arms, better suited for breaking men than comforting infants. Nothing worked. His son was fading, and Dae-sung was watching him slip away. 6 rows back, Tabitha Evers heard those desperate cries and felt her body betray her. Her breasts ached with sympathetic response, milk threatening to leak through the nursing pads she still wore out of habit, out of grief. She pressed her eyes shut, trying to will away the physical memory that refused to die. 3 weeks. It had been 3 weeks since she'd buried her own son. 3 weeks since she'd held that tiny body, still warm but terrifyingly silent. 3 weeks since the doctors had spoken words that shattered her universe. Multiple organ failure. We did everything we could. Tabitha had maxed out every credit card, sold everything of value, fought with insurance companies until her voice went hoarse. And still, it hadn't been enough. Now she was flying home to an empty apartment and an eviction notice, trying to figure out how to survive in a world that had taken everything from her. She'd been a pediatric nurse once, before medical bills consumed her savings, before she had to choose between her son's experimental treatments and keeping the lights on, before she learned that love and desperation couldn't cure what money and luck couldn't touch. The crying intensified, escalating into a pitch that made her chest constrict painfully. She knew that sound, the frantic, starving wail of an infant whose body was shutting down from hunger. That sound triggered something primal in her, something that overrode every rational thought. Her hands trembled as she gripped the armrest. "Ma'am, are you feeling all right?" A flight attendant paused beside her, concerned. Tabitha looked up, then back toward the sound. Toward seat 1A. "That baby. He sounds I'm a nurse. Was a nurse. Maybe I could help?" The attendant's expression shifted between relief and hesitation. "The passenger has been very firm about refusing assistance. But if you'd like to try, I suppose it couldn't make things worse." Tabitha unbuckled her seatbelt before her brain could overrule her heart, before fear could drown out instinct. She followed the attendant down the narrow aisle, each step making her pulse thunder louder in her ears. This was insane. She was still lactating, her body hadn't accepted that there was no longer a child to feed. But she couldn't just offer to breastfeed a stranger's infant, could she? A powerful stranger's child. A man who radiated danger like heat from asphalt. Then she saw him. Cheon Dae-sung sat like a king, surveying a kingdom he couldn't control. Even in crisis, he commanded the space-sharp cheekbones that could cut glass. A jaw carved from stone and shadowed with precisely maintained stubble. Eyes so dark they seemed to swallow light whole. The tattoos marking his neck told stories written in ink and violence, traditional imagery that branded him as someone lethal, someone untouchable. He wore authority like a second skin. Danger rolled off him in waves that made every survival instinct she possessed scream at her to turn around, sit down, mind her own business. But the baby in his arms looked so impossibly small against that broad, unforgiving chest. The infant's face was flushed crimson from crying, tiny features twisted in agony, skin a beautiful blend of Korean heritage and something else, a complexity that spoke of a love story she'd never know. Tabitha noticed other things too. The way other passengers, particularly the handful of other Koreans in first class, refused to make eye contact when Dae-sung's gaze swept across them. The way the man seated directly behind him sat with military stillness, earpiece visible, hand resting near his jacket in a way that screamed concealed weapon. The way the air itself seemed to bend and warp around this man, as if reality recognized his dominance. And she was about to walk up to him and offer to breastfeed his dying child. God help her. Tabitha's worn sneakers made no sound on the carpeted aisle as she approached seat 1A. But she felt every eye in first class tracking her movement. A woman in Hermes whispered something to her companion behind a manicured hand. A businessman in the row across pointedly placed noise-canceling headphones over his ears. His expression twisted with irritation that he didn't quite dare voice aloud. The baby's screams had taken on a frightening quality, now weaker, more desperate, the sound of a small body reaching its limit. Tabitha had heard that sound before in the NICU. In those terrible moments before alarms started blaring and doctors came running. It was the sound that preceded crisis. When she reached Dae-sung's row, she found herself looking down at a scene that broke something in her chest. This dangerous man, this dragon wrapped in expensive wool, was holding his son with the careful desperation of someone afraid he might shatter what he was trying to protect. The baby's tiny face had gone from red to an alarming bluish tinge around the lips. He was hyperventilating between screams, his small body rigid with distress. "Excuse me." Tabitha's voice came out steadier than she expected. "I'm a pediatric nurse. Your son, he needs help. Now." Dae-sung's eyes snapped to her, and for a moment she understood why grown men feared this person. His gaze was a weapon, sharp enough to flay skin from bone. She watched him take her in with brutal efficiency, the faded beige shirt with a small stain near the hem, the jeans that had been washed too many times, the absence of jewelry or anything suggesting wealth. She saw the calculation happening behind those obsidian eyes, the assessment of threat and value, but his son chose that moment to let out a weak, broken cry that sounded nothing like the healthy screams from before, and something shifted in Dae-sung's expression. "What can you do?" His voice was controlled, but she heard the hairline fracture underneath. The fear. Tabitha's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment, the point of no return. She could offer to check his temperature, suggest calling ahead for medical assistance, give him any number of professional recommendations that wouldn't require her to cross the boundary she was about to cross. Instead, she told him the truth. "I lost my son 3 weeks ago." Her voice dropped low enough that only Dae-sung could hear. "My body doesn't know he's gone. I can feed your baby. If you'll let me." The words hung in the air between them like a confession, like a covenant. Dae-sung stared at her for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds. She watched something move across his face. Shock, perhaps, or disbelief. His grip tightened on his son, a possessive gesture that she recognized. The instinct to protect your child from a world that had already proven itself cruel. "You're serious?" It wasn't a question. "He's starving." Tabitha gestured to the infant, whose cries had deteriorated into weak, gasping whimpers. "You can see it. I can help him, right now. Or you can wait until we land in 5 hours and hope he makes it that long." She shouldn't have said it so bluntly, but there wasn't time for gentle phrasing. The baby was in distress, and every minute mattered. Dae-sung looked at his son, then back at her. She saw the moment he made his decision, saw the way his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, the way his jaw unclenched just slightly. It was surrender, but not weakness. It was a father choosing his child over his pride. "What do you need me to do?" "Switch seats with me," Tabitha said quietly. "Give me room to hold him properly." The man behind Dae-sung, the bodyguard with the earpiece, tensed visibly, his hand moving inside his jacket. Tabitha's pulse spiked, but Dae-sung raised one hand in a small gesture that froze the man in place. "It's fine." Dae-sung's voice carried absolute authority. "Move." They shifted positions in the cramped space, Tabitha sliding into the window seat while Dae-sung took the aisle. His presence was overwhelming. This close, he radiated heat and controlled violence, every movement precise and measured. When he placed his son in her arms, their fingers brushed, and she felt the calluses on his hands, the raised edges of old scars hidden beneath expensive fabric. The baby was lighter than he should be. Tabitha's nurse training kicked in automatically, noting the poor muscle tone, the way his fontanelle looked, slightly sunken, the papery quality of his skin that suggested dehydration. This child had been refusing to eat for longer than was safe. "Close your eyes," she told Dae-sung softly. "Give us privacy." To her surprise, he obeyed without argument, turning his head toward the aisle and closing his eyes. His jaw remained tight, his hands fisted on his thighs, but he gave her the space she'd requested. Tabitha unbuttoned her shirt with shaking fingers. acutely aware of the man sitting inches from her, of the passengers who would inevitably notice what was happening. She adjusted her nursing bra and brought the baby to her breast, praying her body would cooperate, praying this desperate gamble would work. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. The baby was too weak, too far gone to latch properly. Tabitha felt panic rising in her throat. What if she'd promised something she couldn't deliver? What if? Then the infant's survival instinct kicked in. He latched with surprising strength, and Tabitha felt the familiar pull and release as her milk let down. The baby made a small sound, not quite contentment, but relief, and began to nurse with the focused intensity of the truly starving. The silence that fell over the first-class cabin was absolute and deafening. Tabitha didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the baby in her arms, watching color slowly return to his lips, feeling the rigid tension begin to leave his tiny body. But she felt the stares burning into her back, heard the sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind her, sensed the shock rippling through the cabin like a shockwave. The other passengers rolled their eyes at the crying baby, caring more about their comfort than a child's pain. If you can't stand selfish people like that, hit subscribe and comment, compassion first, to show you stand for love. Beside her, Daesung sat perfectly still, his eyes still closed, but she saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, rough with an emotion she couldn't name. Thank you. Those two words carried the weight of a man who rarely thanked anyone for anything, who wasn't accustomed to being in anyone's debt. Tabitha understood in that moment that she'd just altered the trajectory of both their lives in ways she couldn't possibly foresee. All she could do was hold this stranger's son and feel her broken heart crack open just a little bit wider. The plane touched down at Incheon International Airport with barely a tremor, the kind of landing that spoke of expert piloting. Tabitha felt the wheels make contact with Korean soil and realized she'd just crossed an ocean while nursing a stranger's child. The baby, she still didn't know his name, had fallen asleep against her chest an hour ago. His breathing finally deep and regular, his small fist curled loosely against her collarbone. She'd kept him there the entire flight, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile spell had settled over them. Daesung had remained silent beside her, occasionally checking his phone with quick, precise gestures, but mostly just sitting in rigid stillness, like a predator conserving energy between hunts. Now, as the seatbelt sign dinged off and passengers began gathering their belongings, Tabitha felt reality crashing back in. What had she done? She'd crossed every professional boundary she'd ever learned, exposed herself to a man who radiated danger, and now she was in a foreign country where she didn't speak the language, holding a baby that wasn't hers. Wait. Daesung's voice was quiet but absolute. Don't move yet. The other passengers filed out quickly, many of them casting backward glances that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed disgust. Tabitha caught fragments of whispered Korean, the tone making the meaning clear even without translation. The woman in Hermes actually wrinkled her nose as she passed, clutching her designer bag closer as if poverty might be contagious. Within minutes, the first-class cabin was empty except for Tabitha, Daesung, and the two bodyguards who materialized from economy like shadows gaining substance. One of them spoke rapidly in Korean to Daesung, who responded with clipped words that carried undeniable authority. "Button your shirt," Daesung said to her, his eyes fixed on his phone screen. "We need to talk." Tabitha's cheeks burned as she carefully adjusted the sleeping baby and fixed her clothing, hyper-aware of how exposed she'd been for the past several hours. When she finished, she looked up to find Daesung watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. His gaze traveled over her deliberately, not with the leering quality she'd learned to expect from some men, but with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating an asset. She watched his eyes take in the frayed hem of her shirt, the jeans with the worn knees, the canvas sneakers that had cost $12 at a discount store because that was all she could afford, the absence of a wedding ring, the exhaustion carved into her face from weeks of grief and stress. "What's your situation?" he asked bluntly. "Excuse me?" "Money. Living arrangements. Why are you still lactating if your son died 3 weeks ago?" His directness should have been offensive, but there was something almost respectful in the way he cut through pretense. He wasn't trying to manipulate her with sympathy. He was gathering information. Tabitha looked down at the baby in her arms. This tiny person who'd found comfort in her body when nothing else would help. She could lie. She could tell him it was none of his business. She could hand him his son and walk away from whatever was about to happen. Instead, she told the truth. "I'm being evicted in 2 weeks. I have $43 in my checking account and $17,000 in medical debt from trying to save my son. I was lactating because I kept pumping. I couldn't stop. My body wouldn't accept that he was gone." Her voice cracked on the last word. "I'm going back to Chicago to move into my sister's basement and try to figure out how to survive bankruptcy." The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Daesung studied her for a long moment, then looked at his son sleeping peacefully in her arms, something the infant hadn't done in 4 months according to the tight set of his jaw. "I have a proposal." He pulled a business card from his jacket pocket and held it between 2 fingers. Pure white cardstock with raised black lettering in Korean and English. Cheon Daesung, CEO, Cheon Holdings. "My son won't eat, won't sleep. He's been wasting away since his mother died. 6 nannies have quit. 2 pediatricians told me there's nothing medically wrong, he's just refusing to thrive." Tabitha felt the weight of the baby against her chest, remembered the desperate way he'd nursed, the relief in his small body when he finally got what he needed. "What are you asking me? Come work for me. Live in my home. Feed my son." Daesung's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he was discussing a business merger rather than something impossibly intimate. "I'll pay you $50,000 a month for as long as it takes. 6 months guaranteed minimum. That's $300,000 even if you only stay the minimum term." The number hit her like a physical blow. Tabitha's breath caught in her throat. $50,000 a month. She could pay off her debt, save money, start over. That amount of money would change everything. "That's insane," she whispered. "That's what my son's life is worth to me." Daesung leaned forward slightly, and she caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something darker gun oil, maybe, or the metallic tang of danger. "I can see you need the money. You can see my son needs you. This is a business transaction." "This isn't business." Tabitha looked down at the sleeping infant. "This is you're asking me to be his wet nurse, to live with you. I don't even know you. You'll have your own quarters. Private space, staff to assist you, security." His jaw tightened. "My world is complicated. There are threats you'll need protection from, but you'll be safe in my home. Threats, protection, security." Every word confirmed what she'd suspected from the moment she saw those tattoos, those bodyguards, the way people flinched from him. Cheon Daesung wasn't just wealthy, he was dangerous in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. "I need to think about it. You have until we clear customs." Daesung stood, and even in the cramped cabin he seemed to fill the entire space. "I'm not a patient man, Miss Evers, but I'm a desperate father. My son is dying because he won't accept anyone else. You gave him what I couldn't. Name your concerns and I'll address them. But decide quickly." He moved toward the exit, his bodyguards flanking him, leaving Tabitha alone with the sleeping baby and a choice that terrified her. She thought about the eviction notice waiting in her mailbox. The collection calls she'd stopped answering, her sister's tight-lipped disappointment every time they spoke, the crushing weight of a future with no hope in it. Then she looked down at the baby boy who'd latched onto her like she was his lifeline, who'd finally stopped suffering because of what her broken body could still provide. $300,000 minimum, maybe more. A chance to not just survive but actually live again. When Daesung's bodyguard returned to escort her off the plane, Tabitha heard herself say the words before her rational mind could stop her. "I'll do it. I'll come with you." The bodyguard nodded once, speaking into his earpiece in rapid Korean. Somewhere ahead of her in the airport, Daesung received the message. The deal was struck. Tabitha stood on shaking legs, cradling the baby close, and followed the bodyguard into a country she'd never planned to visit, into a life she couldn't possibly imagine, carrying someone else's son against her heart while her own lay cold in Chicago soil. The black Mercedes sedan that met them at the airport had windows tinted so dark that Tabitha couldn't see out, only catch occasional flashes of Seoul's glittering skyline as they wound through streets she couldn't name. The baby Daesung had finally told her his name was Minho, slept in a designer car seat that probably cost more than her last month's rent. She kept one hand on his tiny chest, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing, anchoring herself to this one real thing, while everything else felt like a fever dream. Daesung sat across from her in silence, working on a tablet with the focused intensity of a man who hadn't stopped working in years. Occasionally his phone would buzz and he'd respond in clipped Korean, his tone shifting between authoritative and lethal depending on who was on the other end. The bodyguards in the front seat never spoke, never turned around, just drove with military precision through traffic that Tabitha couldn't see. After 40 minutes, the car began climbing. The road changed beneath them, becoming smoother, quieter. When they finally stopped and the door opened, Tabitha stepped out into another world entirely. The Cheon estate rose before her like something carved from ice and steel. It wasn't a house, it was a fortress dressed in modern architecture. 3 stories of glass, concrete, and sharp angles, brutally beautiful in its cold precision. Floodlights illuminated manicured gardens that looked more like art installations than places meant for living. A stone pathway led to massive double doors made of dark wood bound with iron. And everywhere were men with earpieces and hard eyes, positioned at intervals that suggested military training. She counted 6 before she stopped counting, realizing there were probably twice as many she couldn't see. "Welcome to your new home." Daesung's voice held no warmth, just statement of fact. He lifted Minho from the car seat with practiced care, and Tabitha noticed how the baby stirred but didn't wake, already trusting his father's touch in a way he hadn't before. The front doors opened before they reached them, pulled by staff who bowed deeply as Daesung passed. Tabitha followed, suddenly acutely aware of her worn sneakers on marble floors that gleamed like black mirrors. The foyer was cavernous and cold, all sharp lines and minimal furniture. Abstract art that probably cost more than her parents' house hung on walls the color of concrete. Everything was monochrome black, white, shades of gray, as if color itself had been deemed too soft for this space. A woman appeared at the top of a floating staircase, descending with the measured pace of someone who knew exactly how much authority she held. She was perhaps 60, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun, wearing a black dress that probably passed for uniform in a house like this. Her face was carefully composed, but Tabitha saw her eyes widen slightly when she took in the scene Daesung holding his sleeping son, and beside him, a black woman in cheap American clothes carrying nothing but a worn purse. "Mrs. Han." Daesung switched to English, probably for Tabitha's benefit. "This is Miss Tabitha Evers. She'll be staying in the West Wing as Minho's nurse. Prepare the guest suite immediately, and ensure she has everything she needs." Mrs. Han's gaze swept over Tabitha like a searchlight looking for contraband. The assessment was quick and brutal, taking in every frayed edge, every sign of poverty, every marker of difference. When she finally spoke, her English was perfect but cold enough to frost glass. "Of course, Mr. Cheon." She didn't bow to Tabitha, didn't extend her hand, didn't offer even the pretense of welcome. "I will have the staff prepare appropriate quarters." The word appropriate landed like a slap. Tabitha heard everything, Mrs. Han didn't say in that single word that she didn't belong here, that her presence was an insult to the house, that whatever arrangement Daesung had made was beneath the dignity of the Cheon estate. "Miss Evers saved my son's life on the plane." Daesung's voice dropped to a temperature that made Mrs. Han's coldness look warm by comparison. "She will be treated accordingly. Is that understood?" "Of course, sir." Mrs. Han bowed, but when she straightened, her eyes found Tabitha's, and the disdain was still there, just hidden beneath a thin veneer of obedience. "If you'll follow me, Miss Evers." Tabitha wanted to say something, to defend herself, to point out that she had more medical training in her little finger than Mrs. Han probably had in her entire body. But exhaustion crashed over her in waves, and she was in a foreign country in a house full of armed men, holding on to her new life by her fingernails, so she swallowed her pride and followed the housekeeper up the stairs. The West Wing was as cold and beautiful as the rest of the house. Mrs. Han led her down a hallway lined with more expensive art, past closed doors that probably hid rooms Tabitha would never see. When they reached her quarters, Mrs. Han pushed open the door with barely concealed reluctance. "You're sweet." The word dripped with irony, as if the idea of Tabitha having a suite was fundamentally absurd. The space was larger than Tabitha's entire apartment had been. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the gardens, a king-sized bed with crisp white linens, a sitting area with furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum, an ensuite bathroom visible through a half-open door, all marble and chrome. It was beautiful. It was perfect. And it felt absolutely nothing like home. The nursery adjoins through that door. Mrs. Han gestured dismissively. "Mr. Cheon will bring the baby when he's ready. Staff meals are served at designated times in the kitchen. You are not to wander the estate unsupervised. There are areas that are restricted for security reasons." "Understood." Tabitha's voice came out smaller than she intended. Mrs. Han turned to leave, then paused at the threshold. When she looked back, any pretense of professionalism had vanished from her face. "I've worked for the Cheon family for 30 years. I've seen women come and go, thinking they could use a baby to worm their way into this family's fortune. Whatever you think you're doing here, whatever you think you'll get out of this, I think I'm feeding a starving baby." Tabitha's exhaustion transformed into something sharper. "That's it. That's all I'm doing here." Mrs. Han's lip curled slightly. "Girls like you always want more than they deserve, but Mr. Chan will see through you eventually. Men like him always do." She looked Tabitha up and down one more time, her gaze lingering on the worn shoes, the cheap clothes, the dark skin that clearly offended her sense of order. "Try not to embarrass the household while you're here." The door closed with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Mrs. Han looked at Tabitha like she was dirt just because she was poor. "If you believe everyone deserves respect regardless of their bank account, like this video right now and comment, 'Respect.'" Tabitha stood alone in her beautiful, cold room and felt tears burning behind her eyes. She'd signed up for 6 months minimum in this house, in this country. with people who looked at her like she was something they'd scraped off their shoes. $300,000 suddenly didn't feel like nearly enough. Through the adjoining door, she heard Minho begin to cry that same desperate, hungry sound from the plane. Her body responded instantly, milk letting down, maternal instinct overriding everything else. Tabitha wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and went to feed someone else's son, because that's what she'd agreed to do. That's what she was worth to them. That, and apparently nothing more. The first 2 weeks passed in a haze of feeding schedules and fractured sleep. Tabitha quickly learned the rhythm of Minho's needs every 3 hours like clockwork, day and night. The nursery became her sanctuary, the one room in the vast estate where she felt like she had purpose beyond being the help that didn't quite belong. It was decorated in soft grays and whites, mercifully warmer than the rest of the house. A rocking chair sat by the window overlooking the gardens, shelves lined with books in Korean and English that Minho was years away from reading. A crib that looked hand-carved, probably worth more than a car. Everything perfect and cold and waiting for life to warm it. Tabitha was there at 2 a.m. on her 15th night, when Dae-sung appeared in the doorway. She'd grown accustomed to his visits. He came every night around this time, silent as a ghost, just to watch his son eat. He never said much, just stood in the shadows like he was afraid getting too close might break whatever spell kept Minho alive. But tonight was different. Tonight he was wearing black silk pajama pants and nothing else. Tabitha's breath caught when she saw him. Not from attraction, though she'd have to be dead not to notice the stark beauty of him, but from what his bare torso revealed. The tattoos she'd glimpsed at his neck and wrists covered far more than she'd imagined. Dragons coiled up his arms, phoenixes spread wings across his shoulders, traditional Korean imagery rendered in black and gray that must have taken hundreds of hours to complete. But beneath the ink, barely visible in the low light, were scars. Dozens of them, thin white lines that spoke of blades, puckered circles that could only be bullet wounds. A long, vicious mark across his ribs that looked like someone had tried to gut him and nearly succeeded. He caught her staring and something flickered across his face, not embarrassment, but a kind of tired resignation. "You see what I am now." His voice was rough with exhaustion. "Still want to stay?" Tabitha looked down at Minho, who was nursing contentedly, his small hand resting against her chest. "I see a man who's been hurt. Doesn't tell me anything about who you are." Dae-sung moved into the room properly, settling into the chair across from her with the careful movements of someone whose body carried old pain. Up close, she could see more details, the way certain scars intersected with tattoos, suggesting the ink had come after the wounds. As if he'd tried to make art from trauma. "My wife died giving birth to him." The words came out flat, factual, but Tabitha heard the grief underneath. Hemorrhage. She was gone before they could stop it. I held Minho for the first time, while Ji-yeon's blood was still on my hands. The image hit Tabitha like a fist to the chest. She'd nursed enough mothers to know how fast things could go wrong, how quickly joy could turn to catastrophe. "I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, but what else was there? He wouldn't eat from the first day. Screamed until he went hoarse. The doctors said there was nothing wrong with him physically, he was just refusing. Dae-sung leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked like what he actually was, a man in his mid-30s who'd lost everything that mattered. I think he knew. Somehow he knew she was gone and he wanted to follow her. Babies can sense grief. Tabitha shifted Minho to her other side, watching him resettle without waking. "They feel what we feel. Your pain became his pain. And now?" Dae-sung's eyes were fixed on his son. "Now he eats. Now he sleeps. Because of you. Because he needed something I could give him." Tabitha chose her words carefully. "But he's gaining weight because you're here every night. Because you love him even though you're terrified." Dae-sung's jaw tightened. "I'm not terrified." "You are." She said it gently, without judgment. "I see it every time you hold him. You're afraid if you love him too much, you'll lose him too. So you keep your distance even though it's killing you." The silence that followed was heavy enough to suffocate. Tabitha wondered if she'd gone too far, crossed some invisible line that would get her fired or worse. But then Dae-sung did something she never expected. He laughed. It was a broken, bitter sound, but it was real. "Everyone else treats me like I'm made of knives." He rubbed his face with both hands, exhaustion seeping through every gesture. "My men, the staff, the families I do business with, they see the dragon, they see the monster. You're the only person who's looked at me and seen someone who's scared, because you are someone who's scared." Tabitha met his eyes. "The tattoos, the scars, the armed guards, none of that changes the fact that you're a father who almost lost his son. That's human. That's real." Dae-sung stared at her for a long moment, and she watched something shift in his expression, like he was seeing her properly for the first time. Not as the help, or the wet nurse, or the desperate American woman he'd hired, but as a person who understood loss in the same language he spoke it. Tell me about your son." The question landed like a blade between her ribs. Tabitha's arms tightened instinctively around Minho, and she felt tears burning hot behind her eyes. His name was Franklin. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. He was 6 months old. I woke up one morning and he was just gone. "SIDS," they said. Like giving it a name made it make sense. It doesn't. No. Tabitha looked down at Minho's sleeping face. It doesn't. I spent everything I had trying to keep him alive after they said his organs were failing. Sold everything. Maxed out cards, begged for extensions on treatments insurance wouldn't cover, and in the end, none of it mattered. Love doesn't cure everything, no matter how much we want it to. Daesung stood and crossed to where she sat. For a terrifying moment she thought he might take Minho away, might decide her grief made her unfit. Instead, he knelt beside the rocking chair, his eyes level with hers. "Thank you." His voice was raw. "For giving my son what I couldn't. For seeing me as human when no one else does. For being here when you have every reason to hate the world." Tabitha felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking, but finally allowing light in after weeks of darkness. "We're both just trying to survive our losses. Then we survive them together." Daesung reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and rested his scarred hand on top of hers where it cradled his son. The touch was warm, gentle, nothing like the violence his scars promised. They sat like that in the quiet nursery while Minho slept between them, two broken people building something fragile and real, from the wreckage of everything they'd lost. The brick came through the nursery window at 3 in the afternoon, shattering the illusion of safety Tabitha had carefully constructed over the past month. One moment she was singing softly to Minho as he dozed in her arms. The next there was an explosion of glass and the solid thunk of concrete hitting the carpet 3 feet from where she sat. She screamed before she could stop herself, curling her body around Minho instinctively, shielding him with her torso. Glass rained down like deadly snow, catching the afternoon light as it fell. The baby woke with a startled cry, and Tabitha was already moving, running for the door even as her mind tried to catch up with what had just happened. The hallway erupted with motion. Guards appeared from nowhere, guns drawn, shouting in rapid Korean. Someone grabbed Tabitha's arm, one of the bodyguards she recognized from her first night, and pulled her away from the nursery, down the hall, into what looked like a panic room hidden behind a bookshelf in the library. "Stay here," he commanded in accented English, then disappeared back into the chaos. Tabitha sank onto a leather sofa, her whole body shaking, checking Minho frantically for injuries. No blood, no cuts, just terrified screaming that she felt in her bones. She pulled up her shirt and brought him to her breast, needing to soothe him, needing to convince herself they were both still alive. The door slammed open 10 minutes later, and Daesung stormed in like violence given form. He was wearing a suit, pristine and perfect, but his eyes were absolutely feral. He crossed to her in 3 strides, his hands hovering over Minho, over her, checking for damage with a desperation that made her heart clench. "Are you hurt?" His voice was deadly calm, which somehow made it more terrifying. "Either of you? We're fine." "What? This?" He thrust a piece of paper at her, his jaw so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. The note was short, written in English for her benefit, she realized with cold horror. The handwriting was precise, almost elegant. "The dragon keeps a pet now. How sweet. We'll enjoy breaking her." It was signed with a single character in red. She didn't read Korean, but she didn't need to. The threat was universal. The Ryu family. Daesung's voice could have cut steel. "My oldest enemy. They've been trying to take my territory for 5 years. Now they know about you." Tabitha's blood turned to ice. "How?" Someone talked. Someone always talks. He took Minho from her arms with shaking hands, holding his son against his chest like he could absorb him into his ribcage, keep him safe inside his own body. "I'm sending you back to America tonight. I'll pay you for the full 6 months, give you extra for the danger I've put you in." "No." The word came out harder than she intended, but Tabitha was already standing, already moving into his space with a fury that surprised them both. "Absolutely not. I'm not leaving him. You don't understand what these people are capable of." "I understand perfectly." Tabitha jabbed a finger toward the shattered window. "They threw a brick through a baby's window. They threatened an infant to get to you. I understand exactly what kind of monsters they are." Daesung's eyes flashed. "Then you understand why you need to leave." "I can protect Minho. He's my son, my blood. They won't actually hurt him, it's against the code. But you?" His gaze raked over her face like he was memorizing it. "You're an outsider. You have no protection. They'll use you to destroy me. So you're just going to let them win?" Tabitha's voice rose. "Let them dictate your life, who you can have in your home, who takes care of your son. That's what they want. They want you isolated and weak. I am weak." The admission came out like broken glass. Because of him. Because of you. Every person I care about is a weapon someone can use against me. Tabitha saw it then, the real fear underneath his rage. He wasn't afraid of the Ryu family. He was afraid of losing someone else he'd started to care about. She'd seen the way he looked at her during their late-night conversations, the way his hand would linger when he passed Minho to her, the way he'd started asking about her day like her answer actually mattered. Listen to me. She grabbed his arm, feeling the tension coiled in his muscles like steel cables about to snap. Minho needs me. Not just for food, he needs stability, routine, someone who isn't terrified every second that he's going to stop breathing. If I leave now, he'll feel it. He'll go back to refusing to eat, and everything we've worked for will be gone. Better that than you dead. Daesung's voice cracked. I can't. I won't have another person's blood on my hands because I was selfish enough to keep them close. This isn't about selfishness. This is about what's best for your son. Tabitha stepped closer, close enough to smell his cologne mixed with the sharp edge of adrenaline. And what's best for him is me staying. Unless you're saying I don't get a choice. Unless this is you showing me that I'm just an employee you can dismiss when things get complicated. The Ryu family threatened an innocent baby just to get power. If you are sick of bullies hurting the innocent, hit that subscribe button and comment, protect the children to take a stand. Something shifted in Daesung's expression. The lethal calm cracked, showing the man underneath, the one who sat with her in the nursery at 2 a.m, who shared his scars, who'd started to smile when Minho laughed. You have no idea what you're asking to stay for. Then show me. Tabitha held his gaze. Show me what I'm staying for. Show me how you protect the people you care about. Because running doesn't seem like your style. And it sure as hell isn't mine. Daesung stared at her for a long moment. Minho quiet now between them. The baby's small hand fisted in his father's shirt. She watched him calculate risks, weigh options, fight with himself over what was right versus what was safe. If you stay, you follow my rules. You go nowhere without guards. You don't leave the estate without my permission. You trust me when I say something is dangerous. His voice was pure steel now, the dragon coming back to the surface. And if I tell you to run, you run. You don't argue, you don't hesitate. You take Minho and you get as far from me as possible. Agreed? It should have felt like a cage. It probably was a cage. But Tabitha looked at the baby in his arms, thought about the empty apartment waiting for her in Chicago, the debt collectors, the grief that would swallow her whole if she went back to that life. Agreed. Daesung closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they were full of something that looked dangerously close to relief. You're either very brave or very stupid. Maybe both. Tabitha reached out and traced her finger over Minho's soft cheek, and the baby turned toward her touch instinctively, already knowing her as safety. But I'm not abandoning him, or you. The last 2 words hung in the air between them, meaning more than either of them was ready to acknowledge. Daesung's free hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with a gentleness that contradicted every scar on his body. Then God help us both. His voice was barely a whisper. Because I just made you a target, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep you alive. Guess we'll find out together. Tabitha leaned into his touch, letting herself have this one moment of weakness, of wanting, before the war they'd just committed to really began. Outside, guards swept the grounds. Glass was cleaned from the nursery floor. The brick sat in Daesung's office like a declaration of war. And somewhere in Seoul, the Ryu family smiled, knowing they'd found the dragon's weakness at last. The storm hit Seoul like divine judgment 3 nights after the brick came through the window. Thunder rolled across the sky hard enough to rattle the estate's reinforced windows, and rain fell in sheets so thick the security lights could barely penetrate them. Tabitha stood in the nursery with Minho against her shoulder, watching lightning illuminate the gardens in stark flashes of white, and felt dread settling into her bones like winter cold. Something was coming. She could feel it in the electric charge of the air, in the way Daesung's guards had tripled their patrols, in the tense set of his shoulders every time he looked at her. The Ryu family had been silent since their warning, and the silence felt more dangerous than any threat. Come away from the window. Daesung's voice came from the doorway, quiet but commanding. He was dressed all in black tonight, no suit jacket, just a fitted tactical shirt that showed the outline of something strapped to his ribs. A gun, she realized. He was armed in his own home. You think they're coming? I know they're coming. He crossed to her, placed one hand on the small of her back. The storm gives them cover. Our cameras can't see through rain like this. Thermal imaging is disrupted by the cold front. If I were planning an attack, I'd do it tonight. As if his words had summoned it, the lights went out. Total darkness swallowed the room for 3 seconds before emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in a sickly red glow. Somewhere in the house, an alarm began to wail. Tabitha's heart kicked into her throat. They cut the main power. Daesung was already moving, pulling his phone from his pocket, barking orders in Korean. Then to her, "Take Minho to the panic room. Now. Don't open the door for anyone but me." Dae-sung. Gunfire erupted somewhere on the ground floor. Not the single shots of target practice, but the sustained automatic bursts of people trying to kill as many others as possible as quickly as they could. Tabitha heard shouting, breaking glass, the heavy thud of bodies hitting floors. "Go!" Dae-sung shoved her toward the door even as he was pulling a handgun from the holster at his back. "Library, behind the bookshelf code, is Minho's birthday. Move, Tabitha." She ran. Minho screamed against her chest, terrified by the noise, by her racing heartbeat, by the chaos erupting around them. The hallway was a nightmare of red emergency lights and shadows, and she could hear footsteps pounding up the main staircase. Heavy boots, too many of them. Behind her, Dae-sung stepped into the hall and became someone else entirely. The gentle father who sang to his son in Korean disappeared, replaced by the dragon everyone feared. She glanced back just once, and saw him drop the first man who crested the stairs with a double tap to the chest that was so precise it looked choreographed. No hesitation, no mercy, pure lethal efficiency. Then she was running again, Minho's screams guiding her like a beacon. The library was 30 feet away, 20, 10. She hit the door and slammed it behind her, fumbled for the light switch with shaking hands. The bookshelf Dae-sung had mentioned was obvious once she knew to look slightly offset from the others. A small keypad hidden in the shadows. She punched in the numbers with trembling fingers. 0427, April 27th, Minho's birthday. Nothing happened. No. She tried again, forcing herself to slow down, to be precise. 0427. The bookshelf clicked and swung inward, revealing the steel door of the panic room beyond. Tabitha lunged for it just as the library door exploded inward behind her. 3 men poured through, dressed in black tactical gear, faces covered. One of them had a gun, one had a knife. The third had his hands empty, and somehow that was the most terrifying of all because it meant he didn't think he'd need a weapon to take her down. Tabitha slammed her palm against the panic room's keypad, but the door was on a timer. She could see the display counting down. 15 seconds until the locks disengaged. She had 15 seconds and 3 men between her and safety. She did the only thing she could think of. She put Minho on the floor inside the bookshelf opening and stepped in front of him, making herself a wall between her baby and the monsters. "You want him, you go through me." The men laughed. Actually laughed, like she'd told a joke. The one with empty hands spoke in accented English. "Boss Ryu sends his regards to the dragon's pet. You're coming with us." "The hell I am." She didn't see him move, didn't process that he was lunging until his hand closed around her arm like a vice. Tabitha screamed and fought, clawing at his face, kicking, biting. She felt her nails break skin, heard him curse, but he was twice her size and trained for this. He wrenched her arm behind her back hard enough to make her vision white out. Behind them, gunfire erupted in the hallway. Close. Too close. Dae-sung's voice roared something in Korean, and the man holding Tabitha's arm suddenly had a hole in his shoulder. He dropped her with a howl, and she scrambled backward toward Minho, and then something hit her in the back of the head, and the world tilted sideways into darkness. Her last conscious thought was the sound of Minho screaming, and the panic room door sliding shut with him inside. Safe. He was safe. Then there was nothing but black water pulling her down. Tabitha woke to motion and pain. She was in a vehicle. She could feel the bumps in the road, hear the engine, smell leather and gun oil and rain. Her head throbbed where they'd hit her. And when she tried to move, she realized her hands were zip-tied behind her back. She's awake. Someone spoke in Korean, and another voice responded with what sounded like approval. Tabitha forced her eyes open and found herself in the back of a van, 3 men watching her with the casual interest of people who'd done this before. Outside the windows, she could see they were driving through Seoul's streets, the storm still raging, the city lights blurred by rain. "Where?" Her voice came out hoarse. "Where are you taking me?" The man closest to her smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Boss Ryu wants to meet the woman who made the dragon go soft. Don't worry. If you cooperate, we might even let you live." Tabitha thought about Dae-sung fighting his way through his own house to protect them. Thought about Minho safe in the panic room, probably still screaming, probably terrified. Thought about the promise she'd made to stay, to not abandon them, to face whatever came together. She'd been wrong. They'd been separated after all, and she had no idea if either of them would survive long enough for Dae-sung to find her. The van turned down a dark alley, and Tabitha closed her eyes, trying to remember every self-defense lesson she'd ever learned, every piece of advice about surviving captivity. She would not make this easy. She would not go quietly into whatever hell Boss Ryu had planned. She would survive this. She had to, because Minho needed her. And Dae-sung God. Daesung would tear the city apart looking for her. She just had to stay alive long enough for him to find her. The warehouse smelled like rust and old blood. They'd dragged Tabitha from the van through rain that felt like needles, into a building that looked abandoned from the outside but was clearly operational within. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting sickly illumination on concrete floors stained with substances she didn't want to identify. Men with guns stood at intervals along the walls, watching her with the flat-eyed interest of predators observing prey. They zip-tied her to a metal chair in the center of the space, her arms wrenched behind the backrest hard enough to make her shoulders scream. Water dripped from her hair, her clothes, pooling at her feet. She was shivering from cold, from fear, from the adrenaline crash that made her feel like she might vomit or pass out, or both. The dragon's pet. The voice came from the shadows, cultured and amused. I must admit, I expected someone more. Impressive. Boss Ryu stepped into the light, and Tabitha understood immediately why even Daesung's men spoke his name with fear. He was perhaps 50, silver threading through black hair, that was slicked back from a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruelty carved into every line. He wore an expensive suit despite the late hour, not a thread out of place, and his eyes held the kind of emptiness that came from doing terrible things so often they no longer registered as terrible. He circled her slowly, appraising, and Tabitha forced herself to meet his gaze even though every instinct screamed at her to look away. You're American, black, poor, from the look of you, he said each word like he was cataloging defects. What could the great Cheon Daesung possibly see in someone so ordinary? Go to hell. The words came out steadier than she felt. Ryu laughed, a sound like glass breaking. Spirit, I appreciate that. It will make breaking you so much more satisfying. He leaned down until his face was inches from hers, and she could smell expensive cologne mixed with something medicinal. Do you know what you are to him? You're not a lover, he's too smart to fall for someone like you. You're not family, you're just the help. You're a convenience. A wet nurse he hired because his son was dying. And when I kill you, he'll mourn for maybe a week before he finds another woman to fill your role. Tabitha's jaw clenched. You don't know him. I've known him for 15 years. Ryu straightened, brushing invisible lint from his sleeve. I knew his father before him. The Cheon family built their empire on blood and fear, just like mine. We understand each other, Daesung and I. We're the same species of monster. His smile was razor-thin, but even monsters have weaknesses. His father's weakness was pride. I used that to destroy 3 of his operations before the old man died. Daesung's weakness was supposed to be his complete lack of attachments. He kept no lovers, no friends, barely spoke to his own syndicate members beyond giving orders. He gestured to her like she was evidence in a trial. And then he went and hired you, brought you into his home, let you near his son. I've had people watching the estate for weeks, and do you know what they reported? He visits the nursery every night. He speaks to you like you're human, not staff. He looks at you like... Ryu's expression turned predatory. Like you matter. That was his mistake. He'll come for me. Tabitha's voice was barely above a whisper, but she meant every word. Oh, I'm counting on it. Ryu checked his watch, a movement so casual it was obscene. I sent him your location 20 minutes ago. He should be here any moment. And when he arrives, I'll give him a choice, his territory or your life, his empire or his pet. He won't choose me. But even as she said it, Tabitha wasn't sure. Daesung had become someone different over the past month, softer around the edges, more human. A man who sang to his son and shared his scars and looked at her like she'd hung the moon. Would that man sacrifice everything he'd built for someone he'd known for 5 weeks? We'll see. Ryu turned toward the entrance, where headlights were now visible through the grimy windows. A single car. No convoy. No army of guards. Right on time. And alone, just as I specified. The dragon really has gone soft. The warehouse door opened, and Daesung walked in like he was entering a business meeting, not a trap. He wore all black, his hands raised to show they were empty, his face a mask of controlled rage that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. He scanned the space in one sweep, counting Ryu's men, assessing exits, calculating odds before his eyes found Tabitha. Something cracked in his expression when he saw her zip-tied to the chair, soaking wet, bleeding from where they'd hit her. It was there and gone in a flash, but she saw it. The fury, the fear, the guilt. Let her go, Ryu. His voice was quiet, deadly. This is between us. No, Ryu smiled. This is exactly what it appears to be. You made her important, which made her valuable, which made her a target. That's on you, old friend. I'm not your friend. No, but we are alike. Or we were, before you started playing house with the help. Ryu gestured to his men, who moved to flank Daesung. "I assume you came armed despite my instructions?" "You assume correctly. Then let's make this civilized. My men will disarm you, and then we'll discuss terms." Ryu's smile widened. "Unless you'd prefer I start removing pieces of your pet while you watch?" Tabetha saw Daesung's hands curl into fists, saw the lethal calculation in his eyes. He could fight. Could probably take down half of Ryu's men before they got him, but not before someone put a bullet in her. "Fine." Daesung's voice was ice. "Disarm me." Two men approached him carefully, like they were handling a live bomb. They pulled a handgun from his shoulder holster, another from his ankle, a knife from his belt. They patted him down professionally, removing what looked like at least 4 more weapons Tabetha hadn't even known he was carrying. When they finished, Daesung stood in the center of the warehouse unarmed, surrounded by enemies, and somehow still looked like the most dangerous person in the room. "There." He met Ryu's gaze. "Now let her go." "Not quite yet." Ryu produced a document from his jacket pocket, unfolding it with theatrical precision. "This is a transfer agreement. Your territory in Gangnam, your shipping operations, and your stake in the casino district. Sign it, and your pet lives. Refuse, and well." He pulled out a handgun, checked the magazine casually. "We've already established what happens then." Daesung looked at the paper, then at Tabetha. She could see him doing the math, weighing his empire against her life. Everything he'd built, everything his father had died protecting, everything that made him the dragon. "Daesung, don't." Tabetha's voice broke. "I'm not worth." "You are." He cut her off, and the way he said it left no room for argument. "You're worth all of it." He took the document from Ryu's hand and signed it without reading. Just wrote his name in bold strokes and handed it back like he was signing a receipt, not surrendering his kingdom. Ryu's smile was victorious. The mighty dragon, brought to heel by a poor black woman. "The families will talk about this for years. Are we done?" Daesung's voice was flat. "Not quite." Ryu raised the gun, pointing it directly at Tabetha's head. "Did you really think I'd honor a deal with you? After everything? You're both liabilities now. Better to eliminate you both and take what's mine anyway." And Tabetha realized with crystal clarity that they were both going to die in this warehouse, and Minho would grow up an orphan, and everything they'd tried to build would end in blood and broken promises. Unless Daesung had one more move left to play. Time seemed to fracture into crystalline shards, each second stretching into eternity. Tabetha watched Ryu's finger tighten on the trigger, watched Daesung's body coil like a spring preparing to launch, watched her own death approaching with the inevitability of sunrise. Her mind raced through everything she'd never do, never hold Minho again, never hear him laugh, never see who he'd become. But her hands, zip-tied behind the chair's backrest, brushed against something sharp on the concrete floor. Glass. A shard from one of the broken windows, perhaps, or a bottle someone had shattered weeks ago. Without thinking, without planning, Tabetha closed her fingers around it and felt it bite into her palm. The pain was clarifying, real. It meant she was still alive, and while she was alive, she could fight. "Any last words, dragon?" Ryu's smile was grotesque in the fluorescent light. "I'll make sure your son knows his father died for a woman who meant nothing. She means everything." Daesung's voice was steady, but his eyes never left the gun. "That's something you'll never understand." Ryu's finger moved. The shot was already happening in Tabetha's mind. She could see the muzzle flash, feel the impact, taste blood in her mouth before the bullet even fired. Instead, she threw herself sideways with everything she had. The metal chair tipped, crashing to the concrete with her still attached, and the glass shard flew from her hand in a glittering arc directly at Ryu's face. It wasn't much, barely even a distraction, but it was enough. Ryu flinched, jerking his head back, and his shot went wide, the bullet sparking off concrete inches from where Tabetha's head had been a heartbeat earlier. In that fraction of a second, Daesung moved. Tabetha had seen him fight before, seen the controlled violence when he dropped the men on the stairs during the siege. But that had been calculated, precise. This was something else entirely. This was the dragon fully unleashed, and it was terrifying and beautiful and absolutely lethal. He closed the distance to the nearest guard in a blur, snapping the man's wrist and taking his gun in a movement so fluid it looked choreographed. The weapon came up and fired twice. 2 of Ryu's men dropped before they could even raise their own guns. Daesung used the first guard's body as a shield, advancing on Ryu even as bullets from the other men thudded into the corpse he held. Chaos erupted. The warehouse became a symphony of gunfire and shouting, and bodies hitting concrete. Tabetha, still zip-tied to the overturned chair, could only watch in horror as Daesung fought his way through trained killers like they were nothing. He was outnumbered 7-1, but he moved like violence was a language he'd spoken since birth, economical, brutal, without hesitation or mercy. A guard appeared above Tabetha, gun raised, and she kicked out blindly with both feet. She connected with his knee and heard something crunch. He went down screaming, and his gun skittered across the concrete right to where her bound hands could reach it if she contorted herself enough. The zip ties cut into her wrists as she strained, feeling blood slick her fingers, but she managed to close her hand around the grip. The problem was aiming while upside down and tied to a chair. The solution was not aiming at all, just pointing the gun in the general direction of threats and pulling the trigger until it clicked empty. She had no idea if she hit anyone. The recoil nearly broke her wrist. The sound was deafening, but the men near her scattered, diving for cover, and that gave Daesung the opening he needed. He reached Ryu, who'd retreated behind a stack of crates like the coward he was. The older man still had his gun, was raising it with shaking hands, his cultured composure completely shattered. "You're finished, Cheon. Even if you kill me, my family will hunt you forever. Then I'll kill them too." Daesung's voice was empty of everything except promise. He knocked the gun aside and grabbed Ryu by the throat, lifting him off the ground with one hand. "You should have taken the deal and let her go. That was your one chance." Ryu clawed at Daesung's hand, his face turning purple, his expensive shoes kicking uselessly at the air. "The families won't let you. The families fear strength, and they're about to remember why they fear me." Daesung's grip tightened, and Tabitha heard something crack. Ryu went limp, and Daesung dropped him like garbage, already turning to deal with the remaining guards. But they were running. The ones still alive were scrambling for exits, abandoning their boss, their mission, everything except the primal urge to survive. In less than 2 minutes, Daesung had destroyed Ryu's entire operation through sheer, overwhelming violence. He stood in the center of the warehouse, chest heaving, covered in other people's blood, surrounded by bodies, and Tabitha thought she'd never seen anyone more terrifying or more beautiful in her entire life. Then his eyes found her, still zip-tied to the overturned chair on the floor, and everything about him changed. The dragon vanished, and Daesung returned the man who sang to his son at 2 a.m, who shared his scars and his grief, who just signed away his empire to save her life. He crossed to her in 3 strides, dropping to his knees beside the chair, pulling a knife from somewhere to cut through the zip ties. "Are you hurt? Did they—" "I'm okay." Her voice shook. Her hands shook. Everything shook. "You came. You actually came." "Of course I came." He pulled her up, checked her over with frantic hands, cataloging every bruise and cut like they were mortal wounds. "Did you think I'd leave you here? Did you think—" His voice cracked. "I would have burned this entire city down to find you." Ryu broke his promise because he has no honor. If you value honesty and hate liars like Ryu, smash the like button and comment "Truth Matters." You gave him everything. Tabitha touched his face, felt the tension in his jaw. "Your territory, your operations. I don't care." Daesung pressed his forehead to hers, and she felt him trembling. "None of it matters. Not compared to you. Not compared to getting you home to Minho." Minho. The name hit her like electricity. Oh God, is he? He's safe. My second locked down the panic room. No one got in. Daesung pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "But we need to leave. Now. Ryu's family will send reinforcements when he doesn't report in." He helped her stand on legs that didn't want to support her weight, kept one arm around her waist when she swayed. Outside, she could hear sirens. Someone had called the police, probably the warehouse neighbors who'd heard the gunfight. Daesung led her to a side exit, into an alley where rain was still falling in sheets. A car appeared from nowhere, one of his men at the wheel. They climbed in, and Tabitha found herself pressed against Daesung's side as they sped away from the warehouse, from the bodies, from the empire he'd just sacrificed. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "You signed over your territory. Ryu's dead, but his family. Now?" Daesung's arm tightened around her. "Now I do what I should have done the moment they threatened you. I disappear. We disappear. All of us." "What are you talking about?" He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that looked dangerously like hope. "I'm talking about leaving. Taking Minho. Taking you. And walking away from all of it. The syndicate, the families, the violence. All of it. You can't just walk away from who you are. Watch me." His voice was fierce. "I've been the dragon for 15 years. I've built empires and destroyed enemies, and done things that would make you run screaming if you knew the details. And for what? So I could sit alone in that cold house and watch my son starve because I was too much of a monster to comfort him? You're not a monster. Maybe not anymore." He touched her face gently, reverent, like she was something precious. "You and Minho, you made me human again. And I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose either of you." Tabitha felt tears burning behind her eyes. Where would we even go? Somewhere quiet. Somewhere Minho can grow up without armed guards and death threats. Somewhere I can teach him to be better than I was. Daesung's thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Somewhere we can just be a family. If you want that. If you want us. She should have said no. Should have reminded him they barely knew each other. That she was just the help. That he was proposing to upend both their lives based on 5 weeks of late-night conversations and forced proximity. Instead, she kissed him, pulled him close and tasted blood and rain and promise, and felt something fundamental shift in her chest. Like a door she'd thought was closed forever had just swung open. Yes. The word came out fierce and sure. Yes, I want that. I want us. The suit burned surprisingly well for something that had cost more than most people's cars. Daesung stood in the backyard of the safe house, his final property, the one no one in the families knew about, and watched the charcoal fabric curl and blacken in the metal drum. The custom tailoring that had made him look like carved obsidian turned to ash. The white shirt that had always been crisp and perfect dissolved into smoke. The tie that had cost a month's salary for most people disappeared like it had never existed. Tabitha stood beside him with Minho on her hip, the baby's fist tangled in her hair, watching the dragon's uniform turn to nothing. The sun was rising over Seoul, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and somewhere in the city, the families were probably tearing themselves apart trying to figure out what had happened. Ryu was dead. Daesung had vanished. The power vacuum would consume them for months. You're sure about this? Tabitha's voice was soft, but he heard the question underneath. Are you sure you can walk away? Are you sure you won't regret this? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. He took Minho from her arms, pressing a kiss to his son's forehead. The baby was thriving now. His cheeks were round, his eyes bright, his little body solid and healthy. He giggled when Daesung tickled his belly, a sound that still felt like a miracle. This suit was a cage. I'm done living in cages. His second in command, the only person he truly trusted, had taken over the syndicate with instructions to legitimize as much as possible and distance himself from the Cheon name. The offshore accounts had been emptied and redistributed. The safe houses had been sold. Every connection to his old life had been systematically severed over the past 72 hours. Cheon Daesung, the Dragon of Seoul, was dead. The families would spread that story themselves, easier to believe he'd been killed than to accept he'd simply walked away. And the man standing in this backyard watching his past burn was someone new. Someone who still didn't have a name yet but was learning what it felt like to be free. Where do we go? Tabitha leaned against him, and he wrapped his free arm around her shoulders, holding his whole world in the circle of his arms. I know a place. He'd been thinking about it for weeks, ever since the brick came through the window and he'd realized he couldn't protect them while staying in Seoul. A fishing village on the southern coast. Small, quiet, tourists visit in summer, but otherwise it's just locals. I bought a house there years ago under a different name. No one knows about it. A house. Tabitha looked up at him, and he saw the hope and fear warring in her expression. You're really doing this. Walking away from everything. I'm walking toward something better. He kissed her forehead, breathing in the scent of her soap and milk and home. Toward a life where Minho can play outside without guards. Where I can teach him to fish instead of teaching him to survive. Where you can, his voice caught, where you can heal from everything you lost. She pressed her face against his chest, and he felt her shoulders shake. I lost a son and found a family. I don't know if I deserve this. We both deserve this. Daesung held her tighter. We both deserve peace. The suit finished burning as the sun climbed higher. They watched until there was nothing left but ash. Then Daesung scattered it in the wind and walked back into the house to pack the last of what they'd need for their new life. 6 months later, Tabitha stood on the porch of their small house and watched Daesung teach Minho to chase waves. The ocean stretched to the horizon in shades of blue and green, and the fishing village behind them was exactly what he'd promised, quiet, welcoming, safe. Their house was modest by any standard, probably smaller than the nursery had been in the estate, but it was filled with light and laughter and the ordinary chaos of a family learning to be together. Minho was walking now, his small legs pumping as he chased the retreating water, shrieking with delight when the next wave came and Daesung scooped him up before it could knock him over. The baby's laughter carried on the salt breeze, and Tabitha felt her heart swell with something she'd thought she'd never feel again. Joy. Simple, uncomplicated joy. Daesung had changed in ways both subtle and profound. His hair was longer now, sun-lightened at the tips from hours on the fishing boat he'd bought. His skin had darkened to bronze, and the tension that used to live in his shoulders had finally released. He smiled more, laughed more, spent hours doing absolutely nothing, except watching his son discover the world. The tattoos were still there. He couldn't erase that past, wouldn't have even if he could. But he'd gotten a new one last month, small and hidden on his ribs where only Tabitha would see it. Franklin's name in English script, with dates that marked a life too short. He's part of our family too. Daesung had said when he showed her. He brought us together. He deserves to be remembered. She'd cried for an hour, but they were good tears, healing tears. Now she watched Daesung trudge up from the beach with Minho on his shoulders, both of them soaking wet and covered in sand, and felt that same surge of gratitude mixed with disbelief that this was her life now. Someone needs a bath, Daesung called out as they approached. And I'm not talking about me. You both need baths. Tabitha laughed, reaching for Minho. You're tracking sand everywhere. Mama! Minho's little hands reached for her, the word clear and perfect. Mama, mama, mama. Tabitha froze. It wasn't the first time he'd said it. He'd been calling her that for weeks now, the word as natural to him as breathing. But it still hit her like lightning every single time, stealing her breath and making her eyes burn with tears she couldn't quite contain. That's right, baby. She pulled him close, breathing in his scent, salt water and sunshine and baby shampoo. Mama's here. Daesung wrapped his arms around both of them, and they stood like that on the porch while the ocean sang its eternal song behind them. A man who'd been a monster, a woman who'd lost everything, a baby who'd brought them both back to life. I'm cooking tonight, Daesung announced, finally releasing them. Fresh fish from this morning's catch. My secret recipe. Your secret recipe is salt and fire. Tabitha rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. Best recipe there is. He grinned, heading for the outdoor kitchen he'd built with his own hands. No contractors, no staff, just him and YouTube videos and determination. The result was lopsided and imperfect and absolutely perfect. Tabitha carried Minho inside to clean him up, listening to him babble about water and fish and dada and mama in his own private language. She changed him into clean clothes, sang him the songs she'd once sung to Franklin, felt the ghost of her first son's memory settling comfortably beside the reality of her second. Through the window, she could see Daesung at the grill, his movements confident and sure as he prepared their meal. He was humming something, a Korean song she didn't know the words to but had learned to recognize by heart. He looked up, caught her watching, and smiled with a warmth that still surprised her sometimes. This was the man who'd signed away an empire to save her life, who'd burned his past to ashes to build their future, who woke up at 2 a.m. not to plot strategy or handle syndicate business, but to check if Minho had kicked off his blanket. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in impossible colors, they ate dinner on the porch. Simple food, grilled fish, rice, vegetables from their tiny garden that produced more weeds than crops but was theirs. Minho sat in his high chair between them, making a mess and laughing at absolutely nothing, the way babies do when they feel safe and loved. Tell me something, Tabitha said quietly, watching Daesung help Minho hold his sippy cup. Do you ever miss it? The power, the respect, No. The answer was immediate and absolute. I don't miss being feared. I don't miss the violence. I don't miss looking over my shoulder every second, wondering which family would move against me next. He reached across the table and took her hand. I miss nothing about that life because I have everything I need right here. Minho chose that moment to throw his spoon directly at Daesung's face, cackling with delight when it bounced off his father's forehead. Everything I need, Daesung repeated, wiping rice off his face, even when he's a tiny terrorist. Tabitha laughed until she cried, and Minho laughed because she was laughing, and Daesung just shook his head with a smile that said he wouldn't trade this chaos for anything. Later, after Minho was asleep in his crib, after the dishes were washed and the house was quiet, Tabitha and Daesung sat on the porch swing and watched the stars emerge one by one over the ocean. His arm was around her shoulders, her head rested against his chest. The night was peaceful and perfect and utterly ordinary. Thank you, Daesung whispered into her hair. For what? For seeing me when I was still a monster, for staying when you should have run, for making me believe I could be something other than the dragon. His voice was rough with emotion. For giving me this life. You gave it to yourself. Tabitha turned to look at him, cupping his face in her hands. You chose this. You chose us. Best choice I ever made. He kissed her softly, sweetly, with all the tenderness he'd learned to carry since that day on the plane when a desperate woman had saved his dying son. They sat there until the stars filled the sky. Two people who'd lost everything finding everything they needed in each other. In the baby sleeping peacefully inside. In the life they were building one ordinary, beautiful day at a time. The dragon was dead. The empire was ashes. But Daesung was finally, truly alive. And for the first time in his life, he was home.